Hello, church family. We're going to be doing session 7 in our Sunday school. We've been going through the book of Romans, but today for Easter, we're going to look at the book of Luke in a lesson titled Raised. It comes out of Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12, and we'll be reading from the Christian Standard Bible. So if you have one of those, you can pull it up on your phone or pull it up in front of you that we can read it. As we get started, I was thinking about a group of guys who do a YouTube video channel called Dude Perfect. That's the name of the guys. And they like to put together these videos of doing kind of impossible sports feats, like throwing a ball or hitting a ball or doing all kinds of crazy things. And I thought about one episode that they did actually back in 2016 called the Dude Perfect World Record Edition. And in it, they set about to break the Guinness Book of World Records records for several different events. And one of them was a blindfolded hook shot in a basketball court. There were just all kinds of different ones, but the one that I thought of that kind of amazed me was there was one called the longest blindfolded basketball shot. And the reason it puzzled me, or the reason it kind of amazed me, was the guy that was going for it. He put the blindfold on and he said, "This is the longest blindfolded basketball shot." And he took a shot. And what happened was that he made it on the very first try. And all the other guys started celebrating and shouting and telling him congratulations. And the guy absolutely would not believe it, because the way Dude Perfect works is they shoot a bunch of footage and eventually they can edit it down to make it look like they've done this in just a short amount of time. But it probably takes days or maybe even a week to get all these trick shots to happen. But this guy made it on the first try, and he would not believe them that whenever they told him that he had made it on his first try. Well, whenever the guy that was there from the Guinness Book of World Records saw the shot, he actually looked at the camera and said, "I don't believe it." We're looking at the book of Luke, and we're looking at the resurrection. And I thought about that video, and I thought about this question: have you ever been telling someone something that was true and they absolutely would not believe you? Isn't that a frustrating thing? What makes it hard for people to believe the simple truth of the gospel that Jesus died, was buried, and raised again from the dead? A lot of times it comes down to what are called presuppositions, or things that they have already believed, or things that they already bring into the argument with them. And I think kind of for us, we live in sort of a fact-check society that we, because of a lot of the history, a lot of the news reporting that goes on, we want to just go find the sources. We want someone to verify for us. And a lot of times that leads to a place, it's not necessarily bad, but a lot of times that leads to a place where we won't believe anything unless it has been rigorously fact-checked to our satisfaction. But that also kind of leads to a different quirk of our society, that we have a lot of people who really ascribe to conspiracy theories, that doesn't matter how much evidence on one side or the other, they want to believe what they want to believe. And it really comes down to be honest with you, a personal refusal either to acknowledge the truth that's there or to believe something else. I was listening to a story recently about a guy named Ignaz Semmelweis, who was in 1847. In 1847, was a Hungarian doctor who did some little research on his own, because he noticed that there were a bunch of people that were getting sick in the hospitals. In fact, it was kind of a dangerous place to go, was a hospital, because you would get sick. Well, Ignaz Semmelweis, the doctor there, he proposed that they do something kind of revolutionary, that instead of doctors going from patient to patient to patient, that maybe the doctors, if they would take time to wash their hands between the patients, that might cut down on some of the infection. Well, as you can imagine, probably the doctors were very upset and even kind of angry at the thought that someone would accuse them of spreading the infection. And they absolutely refused to follow his advice and instruction. And it wasn't really, that happened back in 1847. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur shared his germ theory in 1881 that people began to go, oh, you know what, maybe there is something to this hand washing. As we look at our story today, it's probably a familiar story that comes out of Luke 24. And if you remember, Luke was a doctor. And Luke also said that he researched and he recorded the story of Jesus. And he recorded the events of Jesus' trial and crucifixion in Luke chapter 23. And then in chapter 23, it closes with Jesus' burial. And it says that they put him in a tomb and they rolled a stone in front of that tomb because there was no time for them to prepare the body. They were going to put Jesus' body in the tomb and then come back later to prepare the body because they had to get ready for the Sabbath. Well, as they had the Sabbath, and on the first day of the week, which was Sunday morning, Luke 24 opens with the story of, it doesn't mention it in Luke, but we know from Mark and from Matthew, the story of Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, going to the tomb to prepare the body of Jesus. And so as we look at Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 5, it says, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the tomb bringing the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. They went in, but did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men stood by them in dazzling clothes. So the women were terrified and bowed down to the ground. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Asked the men. It's kind of an interesting question. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? What did they expect to find when they went to see him? Well, they had brought spices to prepare the body. They had brought things to prepare Jesus' body for burial, and they were surprised by the absence of the body. So they were perplexed and probably frustratingly confused, frustratingly so, that they had seen their friend crucified and they had come to do an honor for him, and they probably feared that someone had been extremely cruel and had carried his body off to desecrate it, to do something worse, to deprive Jesus of a decent burial. And so they were upset to find that they couldn't even do for Jesus one last thing to honor him. And then all of a sudden these guys, it says these men appeared. We know they're angels. These men showed up in dazzling clothes, and it says that they were terrified. Now, I'm not sure that it means necessarily scared. It just means sort of overwhelmed. They didn't know what was going on. I was actually walking the other day, and as I was walking kind of around down the lane in the walking park here in Emory, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me, and in my fear, I kind of turned around and saw someone approaching quickly and got a little bit scared until I realized it was a woman. It was about 115 pounds or so, just jogging past me. And then I became embarrassed. What were you scared about? But I was scared because of the surprise of not expecting someone there, where you can imagine these women terrified that these 2 men stood before them. And then they asked him that puzzling question, why are you looking for a dead guy? Well, the answer is because he was a dead guy. That's what they expected. They knew Jesus had died, and they knew they had put him in the tomb, and so they came expecting to find Jesus exactly where they had put them. And then the men shared in the next few verses why they should not expect to find Jesus among the dead. It says, he is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, it is necessary that the Son of Man be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and rise on the 3rd day. And they remembered his words. Returning from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. And you see this picture of remembering and reporting. The angels told them to remember, right? What Jesus had already told, reminded them that Jesus regularly told his disciples. As we've gone through the book of Mark, you remember that there were at least 3 times that Jesus predicted his death and that he was going to suffer at the hands of sinful men. And so the angels were saying, remember what Jesus has already said. And then they said, go and report. Go back and tell someone. Go back and tell those from whom you came about what you've seen here. I remember many times sitting around my grandparents' table and sometimes sitting around the table at my own parents' house as we kind of tell stories about growing up and tell stories about the things that we've done. We kind of tell, to be honest with you, the same stories. And as we tell those same stories, we do that because there are new people sometimes in our midst who haven't heard those stories. And so we want to include them in understanding kind of this common history that we have together as a family. And we want to encourage each other with those shared experiences that as we get together, we say, oh, do you remember the time that I was talking to my mom before, do you remember the time that our water line froze and we didn't have water for a few weeks? And so we had to bring water in. Do you remember, I tell people, do you remember whenever we were growing up and we didn't have air conditioner because we couldn't afford to have the air conditioners in the house? And there are so many stories that we tell just to kind of bring each other together, to include each other, to remind each other of where we've been, and also to remind each other of important experiences. One of the things, whenever we buried my grandfather, I remembered a lot of the experiences that we had, and we talked about those experiences together, remembering him and remembering the things that we've done, because that's important. And so the angels tell the women, go back and report, go back and tell what you've seen. That way that what you know can be passed on to other people. It's good to revisit. It's good for us to revisit the crucifixion story and the resurrection story often because they are foundational to our faith. The resurrection of Jesus is the foundational hope of Christianity. And it's comforting to know that in hard times have been harder. And yet Jesus has come through and God has worked it out even then, and that we can trust him in the midst of the times that we're facing now. And we also tell it, like I said, to inform others of the truth of the resurrected Christ, that maybe there were people who haven't heard that yet, that need to hear that. And that's why we tell those stories. Well, the women were faithful to report, and the early church, to be honest, was faithful to investigate and to report themselves so that you and I can hear the gospel of Jesus and that we can find hope in knowing the resurrection of Christ and what happened in that story. And the story goes on in verses 10 through 12 of Luke 24. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them were telling the apostles these things, but the words seemed like nonsense to them, and they did not believe the women. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb, and when he stooped to look in, he saw only the linen cloths, so he went away amazed at what happened. And so you see, as they went back and shared, the women went back and shared what they saw and experienced, you see that what they shared was confirmed, that there was actually disbelief among the first audience. And that's kind of important because it, number one, tells us that the disciples weren't just a bunch of gullible people that would believe anything you tell them, that they had the same response or reaction that you and I would, that we go, people don't usually rise from the dead. And they went to investigate the truth of what the women said, and they found out, exactly what they said is true. And so they investigated and they found those same things to be true. And we also know from reading the rest of Luke chapter 24, the other events that happened, that Jesus appeared to some disciples on the road to Emmaus, and that those disciples came back to share with the disciples in the upper room. And Jesus even appeared there to the disciples in the upper room, that over and over and over and over, Jesus confirmed his resurrection and repeatedly showing himself and repeatedly telling others the truth that he had risen from the dead. And the resurrection was repeated often, and it's important that it was repeated often because that way we can know among many different people, not just one person, but many different people have verified the same thing. And this is kind of important. If we were to tell a story about you're trying to convince somebody of something that happened, you probably wouldn't start it off by saying, well, I didn't actually believe it at first myself, right? You would want to make yourself, oh no, I knew it the whole time. I was brilliant and I understand all sorts of things. But this is an important picture that the disciples, when the resurrection first happened, they didn't believe it. They didn't understand it. They didn't get it. And as they investigated, that's when they came to the truth of the resurrection. The scholarly term for these that we've been talking about is, number one, the criterion of embarrassment. That it was embarrassing to the authors of the story, that they would tell the story in light that they probably wouldn't have done if it wasn't true. If they were just making up a story, they might have made it up, or would probably make it up, making themselves kind of the heroes of the story. But every single one of them said, no, this is the truth. And it's kind of embarrassing to me that I didn't understand it at first as well. And we also talk about the criterion of multiple attestation, that lots of people saw it and that lots of people shared. Sometimes we kind of feel the need to prove, is the word that we use, to prove the resurrection of Christ. Well, I don't know if you know this, but the word prove is actually a math term. It actually means to test the accuracy of a calculation. And whenever we talk about proof, yes, we use it kind of in the law, we use it in philosophy, but we don't really mean proof the way that we mean in math. Even in science isn't proven the way that you would prove in math. Science is kind of thought about, and you have a hypothesis and you test it. And as you kind of test it, you either tend to think, yes, it happens this way, or tend to think, no, it doesn't seem to be recurring that way. But to be honest with you, by scientific method, it is by definition impossible to test unrepeatable events, right? You can't scientifically prove historical events. You can't make them happen over and over. History is actually what's called observed, that as people are experiencing an event, they can turn and tell those people, and they can attest to what they've already seen, kind of like the blindfold basketball shot, the guy that didn't believe that he had made it, right up until they told him, no, yeah, you made it. You made the basketball shot. It's good for us to tell the story of Jesus' death and resurrection regularly because of the original believers' experience, and because it encourages us to, as a family, to celebrate the common hope that we have from our common history. And so let's be faithful to continue to share the story of Jesus in his death and especially his resurrection from the dead. So let me give you a couple questions to consider. Number one, what difference does the resurrection of Jesus make in the way that you live your life today? Number two, how does the corporate Bible study and fellowship encourage us to remember and obey Jesus' words? A lot of times my family, I like to speak in movie quotes, and I'll even talk with my friends. I'll text them a movie quote, and we just kind of laugh about those remembered experiences. I thought about that, and also I have some friends on Facebook that share experiences that they have, and they also share a memory verse or a Bible verse. And Brother Richard's been sharing some Bible verses that he's been studying on his own, and what that's meant to him and what that's done for him. And that's something that you and I can do, that we can text someone, or we can get on social media and share a verse that has brought some significance to us. And so I'm going to give you a challenge and encouragement that you would call someone or text someone or reach out through social media and share with someone something that you were reminded of today or this week that has pointed you to Christ. And then the third question would be this: with whom can you share about the resurrection of Christ? I want you to think about the people who may not already be in the family, the ones who are kind of close by, who don't know the stories yet, or maybe don't know the fullness of the story. With whom can you share the fullness of the story of Jesus' resurrection from the dead? And find a way to share that with them this week. Find a way to share with them the fullness of the gospel, the fullness of the story of Jesus' resurrection. I love you guys. Happy Easter. And let me pray for us, and we will finish our time here. Jesus, I love you. And thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy, your kindness. But God, thank you most of all that we have hope because you have risen from the dead. That we do not serve a God who is laying in a tomb somewhere, but you are God. You demonstrated that you are God because you rose again from the dead. Help us to find you hope in that and to rest in that. I love you, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.